So this lecture is going to focus on photosynthesis, and then we'll follow up with cellular respiration. Both of these topics are difficult topics to talk about because they involve a lot of chemical reactions and they can be very complex. But I want you to think about photosynthesis and cellular respiration as two chemical pathways that complement each other because one is almost the reverse of the other one. So we're going to present these together, and I want you to kind of think about comparing and contrasting these two different chemical pathways. Kind of compare what are the similarities between them and what are the differences between them. So photosynthesis, we're going to start out with. So when you think of photosynthesis, you automatically probably think about plants. I mean, as humans, we are not photosynthetic. That would be lovely if we were, right? We would never have to worry about food because we would be able to produce our own food. But we're not. And so therefore we have to rely upon plants to provide food. Or rely upon plants to provide food for the animals that we like to eat. So plants are the very foundation of our food chain, and they're extremely important because they're able to produce their own food sources. And they do this by converting energy. They convert light energy into chemical energy. And all of this happens within the cells of the plant. So this image here is to kind of give you an idea of where we're going to be focusing, right? So we start out talking about plant tissues. So we usually think of the leaves as where photosynthesis takes place, but any part of the plant that is green can actually be photosynthetic. But the purpose of the leaves is mainly to provide a very broad surface for the plants to be able to capture sunlight. So if we look at a cross section, so if we were to cut across the leaf tissue and then look at that cut end, this is what we would see. So there's an epidermal layer that we have on top here. Sorry, my lines aren't very straight. And we have a lower epidermal layer as well. And we have stomata, which are openings in the lower epidermis for gases to move into the interior tissue of the leaf. So this allows gas exchange to occur because during the process of photosynthesis, plants are producing oxygen and they require carbon dioxide. So therefore, it's very important that gases get into this middle layer. And it's in this middle layer that you see all these green things, right? So these are individual cells that you see. So that's one cell, and that's another cell. And these might look very similar to some of the plant cells that you've looked at under the microscope. And then each of these little green dots inside of the plant cell is an organelle that's called a chloroplast. All right, so if you looked at the Elodia under the microscope, you might remember seeing a cell that looked like this, and then all these green circles are chloroplasts. So the chloroplast is the organelle where photosynthesis takes place. So here's a chloroplast over here, a representation of what it looks like. And the chloroplast has one membrane and then a second membrane. So it has a double membrane. And remember, that's part of that endosymbiont theory. And inside all these green membranes are called thylakoid membranes. So thylakoid membranes. And the area around the thylakoids is called the stroma. It's kind of like a liquid-filled region that takes up the rest of the space within the chloroplast. Down here is an electron micrograph image of a chloroplast. And once again, all these kind of dark areas, right, are these stacks of thylakoids. So these are just stacks of thylakoids, one on top of another. And then you see little individual thylakoids connecting those stacks together. So that's an actual image of a chloroplast, what it looks like. So these thylakoid membranes are kind of important to know because this is where the pigments reside. So you said photosynthesis is this process where plants are capturing sunlight. This is solar energy that we're talking about, sunlight, and we want to convert this energy into a chemical energy, and that is going to be in the form of glucose. So if you think about it, glucose is a type of carbohydrate. We eat carbohydrates all the time, and we eat them because our bodies require energy. So carbohydrates provide energy for us. Same thing for a plant. The plant requires energy in the form of food molecules. So the plant is producing a glucose molecule by the end of photosynthesis. And the way to make that glucose molecule, which has energy within it, is to take the energy from the sun and store it up within the bonds of that glucose molecule. And the only way to get that energy from the sun into a chemical energy is to absorb it. So we need pigments to absorb this sunlight. That's their main purpose, is to absorb light. So let's look at our equation for photosynthesis. So we've already talked about the fact that there is light. Light is required. And we're going to need carbon dioxide, because by the end, we're going to produce a glucose molecule. So C6H12O6 is what we call glucose. So this is our carbohydrate. And since it is a carbohydrate, it has a carbon backbone. It has 6 carbon atoms. So over on the left-hand side are what we call our reactant molecules. So these are the molecules that we kind of need in order for photosynthesis to take place. And over on the right, on the other side of the arrow, are the products. All right, so these are our reactants. A little slow writing with my mouse here. And over on this side are what we call the products. So everything that's on the right has come from the sources that we have on the left-hand side. So if we have 6 carbons, we look over to the left-hand side to say, where did those carbons come from? Those carbons had to have come from the carbon in the carbon dioxide. Okay. We have oxygen that's being produced, and we love oxygen, right? We need oxygen to breathe, and we use that oxygen that we breathe in for the process of cellular respiration, which we'll talk about next. Plants don't need all the oxygen that they make, so some of that oxygen is given off in the form of this oxygen gas, and this oxygen actually comes from the water molecule. I know carbon dioxide also has oxygen, but it's actually the oxygen from the carbon dioxide goes into the glucose molecule and not the oxygen gas that's given off. Okay, and then water is reformed, but we're not going to worry about that so much. So photosynthesis, we're going to divide up into 2 different stages, what we call the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions, as the name says, require sunlight. So we need light to drive these first set of reactions. So as it says, the goal is to convert light energy into chemical energy. So during the light-dependent reactions, we're not going to make a sugar yet. Right? Instead, we're just converting that light energy into different forms of chemical energy that we can then utilize later on to make our sugar. So the light-dependent reactions require pigments, right? We've already said that pigments are responsible for capturing sunlight, and the main pigment that's used is called chlorophyll. This is why plants are green in color, is because of that chlorophyll molecule. So the chlorophyll is the main pigment that helps to absorb sunlight. So we've got a very complex picture over here. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Flipped my screen without meaning to. All right. So we've got a membrane, right? You should recognize it as a membrane. We've got little phospholipids right here. So this is our thylakoid membrane. We said this is where the light-dependent reactions are going to take place, is in the thylakoids, because this is where our pigments are. So think of this area as this is kind of where we've got a pigment, we've got more pigments, because light's coming down and they're going to be absorbed by those pigment molecules. Okay, and these pigments are going to help to move electrons, kind of energize electrons. And these electrons are ultimately going to be captured by a molecule that's called NADPH. Don't worry too much about this molecule, all right, what it stands for. Just know that it kind of carries energized electrons, and we're going to need them later on. We're also going to produce what's called ATP as part of this, all right? So ATP, sorry, I keep on flipping. We got ATP and NADPH as energized electrons. So these are the forms of chemical energy that I was talking about. So our light-dependent reactions basically absorb sunlight using chlorophyll pigments, and that light energy is being converted into the forms of energized electrons in the form of NADPH and in the form of ATP. So if you listen to the ATP lecture, you would know that this is energy, stored up energy. So it's helping to combine a phosphate to our ADP to make our ATP molecule. All right, so there's a lot more, as you can see, kind of going on here, but I'm going to gloss over that because we're trying to simplify this. So the second part is called the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. So independent referring to the fact that light is no longer needed because we've already captured the light and converted it into the form of ATP or NADPH. So what we made during the light-dependent reactions, we're now going to utilize during the light-independent reactions. All right, so this is where we actually produce a glucose molecule. So another name for this reaction is also called the Calvin cycle, after Melvin Calvin, who came up with it. So you see carbon dioxide coming in. We already mentioned that carbon dioxide is required because we're trying to make a carbohydrate, a glucose molecule. So carbon dioxide is going to come into the cycle. You see ATP produced by the light-dependent reactions is getting converted to ADP. So in other words, we're attaching that phosphate group to an intermediate molecule that's part of this Calvin cycle that you don't see. But we do see glucose exiting the cycle. So glucose is being produced. But since this is a cycle, we need to kind of close off the loop here and regenerate our starting compounds. So in order to do that, we're going to use some of the energized electrons to reduce our intermediate molecules, and we're going to use more energy from our ATP. Okay, so the main goal here is that we're using the chemical energy of ATP that we made during the light-dependent reactions and the energized electrons from NADPH. We're bringing in carbon dioxide, and all of that is going to help us to produce a glucose molecule. All right, so in the last few seconds, we've got a question here, and see if you can answer this question. What is the name of the special pigment inside the chloroplast that absorbs light? It is going to be chlorophyll, right? Chlorophyll is our pigment from the light